Hello everyone, welcome to Liberation Hour Radio, live on 102.7 FM and on Facebook and YouTube. I'm your host Varun, and tonight we have a special guest with us. I would like to welcome Debra Coore. Welcome Debra for being on our show.
No worries, good to be here.
So Debra is a Canada-based animal rights and racial justice activist who is actively involved in social justice work. Debra has worked with Vegan Outreach, Challenge 22, Mississauga First Save, Anonymous for the Voiceless, and Direct Action Everywhere. Outside of animal rights, she has worked with the Prisoners Correspondence Network, Movement Defense, and Moyo Health and Community Services. Debra will be with us tonight to talk about the ongoing protests in the United States against police brutality and institutional racism, Black Lives Matter, and how we can show solidarity with them. So let's just get into this, Debra. There have been Black Lives Matter protests in the past. What makes things so different this time?
I guess in this case, there's just a lot of things kind of happened in a very short span of time. So you've had folks kind of stuck indoors with the kind of lockdowns and pandemics going on. And, you know, shortly earlier, we've had kind of a span of cases of police brutality across the US kind of really hitting its peak with George Floyd in the States last week. And then here in Canada, we had an incident with Regis Korchinski Packet, and kind of that ignited the Canada side of things. So it's just been a lot of pent up tensions and an ongoing problem that hasn't really been addressed in a meaningful way.
Absolutely. Recently, we have also seen in Canada that there's this thing trending in Twitter, meanwhile in Canada, where people are saying that things are not bad here, you know, comparing Canada with the United States and concluding that anti-Blackness and racism is just a US problem. Is that the case? Like, is that even slightly true?
It's a misconception I've heard quite often. Like, I remember even when I was in school, there were kids, you know, who didn't realize that Canada had slavery as well. When you're dealing with countries that are built off of the African slave trade and where a large majority of their wealth historically came from the African slave trade, so that includes a lot of South America, that includes the Caribbean, that includes America and Canada. We're going to have the same kind of racial tensions spill out, even though it's been 300 years, just because of that shared history of colonialism and the slave trade. Even in Canada, where we're looking at hate crimes, you see the number of incidences year by year, you know, spiking at 36% right now of all hate crimes, according to a police report from the Toronto Police, from the Canadian Police, kind of showing that, you know, 36% of all hate crimes target people who are within the Black community, and that we're getting about 23 incidents per 100,000 people. So that's a lot higher than other groups, where the second highest group, which would be kind of an umbrella of West Asian and Arab folks, seeing probably about 12 incidents per 100,000 people. So it is a significant difference in how much, I guess, racism plays a part in Canada and kind of the relations between, you know, Black Canadians and Canadians of other ethnicities.
This actually proves a point about the need of Black Lives Matter in Canada, because we have lots of folks who think that anti-Blackness and racism is a US problem, and Black Lives Matter should not have place in Canada because we have things are not as bad in Canada, which again shows like their ignorance and how, you know, a lot of people are disconnected from the reality of what's going on in this country. So this brings me to my next question about allyship. What can people who are not Black can do to support the Black community in Canada and United States and other parts of the world?
That's an important question. I think right now, what I have seen a lot of, which is kind of critical, is moments of solidarity, which is just reaching out to, people on social media or to people personally in their lives, kind of letting them know that they see the problem, they understand it's a problem, and they recognize that it's not acceptable, and that they do want to be there in the capacities that they can. That itself makes a huge difference. And that's really kind of the first step. I think another important step is kind of realizing that history. So becoming educated on the history, beyond learning about Harriet Tubman in grade school, understanding kind of what the Black experience is like for Canada, and that there are different Black experiences. There are people whose families have lived here, since they were brought over to be slaves. There are people who immigrated here recently from Africa, from the Caribbean, and they're all gonna have a different culture and different experiences with being Black in Canada. And kind of hearing people and hearing about those differences and what they're experiencing on the day-to-day is a kind of a good way to start figuring out how you can show support in the right way. Supporting Black groups and businesses that really help, especially minority and immigrant communities, to kind of find housing, food, employment, to get legal aid when they are being treated unfairly. Putting your money and your time into these organizations is a really good step towards kind of having true allyship and really making a difference to a lot of these communities. And then the next level up, we got finding out about Black-owned businesses in your area and trying to kind of support those entrepreneurs, in giving back to their communities and making sure that the money kind of stays in these communities.
Those are some really good tips, and hopefully, we will have people who actually, instead of just, sharing posts on social media, which is really important, they need to go to the next level and, look at different ways to support the Black communities and uplift the Black communities. And so whenever we talk about racism or police brutality, there's this idea that, oh, that was just an isolated incident that's just happening on like an individual level, not a part of a bigger system that is, exists to oppress certain marginalized communities. How do you address that idea?
Yeah, I think for a lot of folks, it's a little bit of out of sight, out of mind. And not seeing the day-to-day, it is kind of difficult to put it in the right context. But I think it needs to be thought of as, there is kind of a bunch of different factors that all play a part, right? There's the history of life after slavery, and kind of people who've been here for a long time trying to build their wealth kind of out from the ground up, given kind of racism being built into the fabric of the country. It is kind of an uphill battle. And you're dealing with people who, and then with poverty comes things like mental health issues are exacerbated, things like not being able to kind of deal with things like sexism and homophobia, and all those just kind of get layered on top of each other, and it makes it really difficult to kind of break free of those barriers. So I think understanding as a multi-dimensional issue and how it kind of intersects with poverty. And then you bring in immigration into it, and folks who are just starting a new life in a new country are going to struggle with issues of poverty as well. I guess tying it back to China being like, this is my life, I'm comfortable where I am, and I have my struggles, and understanding how maybe someone else's struggles could be heightened by adding the racial component to their day-to-day. So it's like, not only do I have to deal with paying my rent and doing my job and dealing with my health, also got to deal with racism on top of that. And even if it's only a little bit of racism, and depending on where you are, it's not, it is going to have an impact on how you're able to just live your daily life.
Absolutely. There's a misconception that, that like what's happening today, like institutional racism, systemic inequality, all of this has nothing to do with, the history of Canada and what it was founded upon. That's a really interesting point, how, what we are facing today, it goes back to what happened like hundreds of years ago with slavery and, genocide in this country. So we have lots of like white followers and subscribers who may be interested in knowing how they can use their white privilege to, challenge racism and white supremacy in their day-to-day life. But before we get into how they can help challenge, systemic racism and, instances of racism, in a short sentence, how would you define white privilege?
White privilege is maybe you are poor and maybe you have to deal with other issues in your life, but those problems aren't coming from your skin color. We all have issues, we all have problems, we all have struggles, but the struggle doesn't come from someone looking at you and not liking you for something beyond your control, which is the skin you were born with.
Excellent. Because whenever this topic of white privilege comes up, you have people, coming up with all the problems. Like, we know that all those problems exist. Nobody's denying that. But we need to, draw this distinction that there are problems that you face based on your identity. For example, you're poor. You'll be discriminated against because of your, economic status. And then you're white. You're not, denied services, or, you're not systematically oppressed because of your skin.
Yeah, and just to add to that a little bit, like, I've worked in web development for a little bit, and it is mostly white and Asian dudes, I will be honest, and they're great. But, there are times when maybe I don't get picked for a job, and it's always like, maybe I didn't present myself well enough in that kind of conversation or interview, or maybe the person who interviewed me was racist. I don't know. There's no way for me to know that, but it's just a little thing like in the back of your head that you always kind of have to wonder. It's like, is it because of my gender? Is it because of my race? Is it because they just didn't like the shirt I had on? I don't know, but I have that kind of added layer of things to worry about. And two of those things I can't change, right? So it's kind of always there. It's always going to be, is this because I'm Black? And I will never know what the answer is.
For sure. Now, continuing my question, how can white people in their everyday lives challenge white supremacy and racism?
I've seen some really good stories. I mean, there's some really bad stories coming out of the US, but there's been some good parts to what is happening. And I've seen people coming out to these protests and marches and rallies. And I've seen people putting, white folks putting themselves in between the police and the people of color and the Black people. And that's been a really powerful thing to see, because unlike Amy Cooper, who used her whiteness as a weapon, if anyone's familiar with that video from Central Park last week in the States, you can use it in the opposite way. I know someone shared a story about how there was an incident and the police were trying to really confront this Black man who was involved. And she put herself in between the police and him, and she said, he's not doing anything. He's minding his own business. You need to leave him alone. I'm recording this, and I'm going to tell your supervisors what you're doing here. And I think there is some power in being able to kind of put yourself in the way of someone who's being harmed and really stand up for that person. Outside of that, if you're not the protest type, or you're not around these scenarios, doing things like really, I guess, listening to people and relaying what people are telling you about their experiences to kind of your friends and family who maybe don't understand it. I will probably never interact with someone. I'm not going to interact with people who don't like to talk to Black people, because they're not going to talk to me, and I'm not going to be in the same spaces as them. But if you have friends and family who are saying things that you're uncomfortable with, or you just don't think are right, they're going to listen to you way more than they would ever listen to me. That your voice has power with someone who cares about you and someone who's willing to listen to you. So it's important to kind of use that voice when you can.
For sure. Dr. Robin DiAngelo often talks about it. You know, if someone who participates in, you know, anti-Blackness, it's very unlikely that they'll listen to Black people, right? So it's the job of, you know, white people who are allies to, you know, use their privileges, use their voices to educate those people. It's really important. And my next question is about supporting Black-owned businesses. So there's this concept I came across recently, Black economic revolution. What is that?
So the Black economic revolution is kind of the idea of kind of keeping money within Black communities and really helping the economic growth of Black communities as a kind of stepping stone for lifting folks out of poverty and really laying the groundwork for having a foundation where people are able to take care of each other within their communities. So for example, you know, for every like dollar spent in a Black community, you're going to, I don't know, Walmart, and you're spending money on something. You know, that money is leaving that community and it's going to, you know, Walmart head office. And the senior employees and the executive level employees who live in mansions outside of those communities. And it's going to kind of the operations of this global kind of, not global, this entity that spans across North America. And it's going to businesses that put their goods in Walmart that have factories in Asia and those people working in Asia. So that money leaves that community and it goes somewhere else and the people don't see it return to that community. So this kind of idea of buying Black only and I think emphasis on local Black only is a way of making sure that money kind of stays where it came from and kind of circulate within the community instead of being extracted from the community.
That's a really interesting concept. Do you personally give your money to Black-owned businesses? Like only Black-owned businesses?
Sorry, I've seen more talk about it, and I think just to very quickly kind of go into the history of where this came from was if anyone's familiar with Tulsa, Oklahoma, there was what was known as Black Wall Street. And this was actually a very successful community because you had people spending money on Black-owned businesses in the community and then, you know, it was being spent there. So people were buying stuff from each other, creating that wealth for each other, and then they were living in that communities and continuing to spend that money so the capital grew, but it wasn't being extracted. And we had a lot of Black millionaires living in that community. So it was doing quite well. And there's actually an incident where a young shoe shiner was accused of assaulting a white woman, and he ended up being arrested, and there was kind of a mob of people from his community trying to get him out of jail. And then there was kind of a counter mob who wanted to keep him in jail and wanted to kind of do some mob justice. And this ended up escalating into a riot. So this riot, like completely, the white folks rioting completely destroyed the city. You know, about 70 to 300 people were killed during the incident. Over $1.5 million was a property was destroyed, and 100,000 people were left homeless. So this eradicated the wealth that had been built in the community, and people were starting over, living in tents, living on the ground, just trying to rebuild what they'd had, but they weren't able to do it from that point forward. So that was a bit off point, but it's important to kind of think of how people have tried to build wealth for Black communities, and it's kind of been systematically torn down throughout the years. So there's kind of this revolution and movement in trying to buy Black owned again and trying to, again, put that money back into those communities. And it is taking off a little bit. But for me, myself, I haven't. Being in the GTA, unfortunately, especially in Mississauga, there isn't a whole lot of opportunity to buy Black only outside of food right now. There's also amazing restaurants, especially in GTA. Shout out to Choose Life and Ital Vital. But And I also think I kind of push back on that concept a little bit, just because, you know, like Kanye West had his $150,000 t-shirt he was selling. Sorry, it was $1,000 t-shirt he was selling. And you have kind of examples of folks like maybe Jay-Z or like Beats by Dre, who do have a significant amount of wealth. And it's not really clear to me that that money gets put back into these communities necessarily. Like, it's still capitalism, and it's still kind of participating in a system of exploitation, where you do have people who are at the top and then there's people at the bottom. It's still a system where the CEO, whoever that happens to be, if it's a Black person, is going to get all the wealth, and the workers who are below them, who are more likely to be Black. And if it's an entirely Black owned and operated business, you know, the Black person who's mopping the floor in the company is not going to be making as much as the person who's owning that business. And that kind of inequality is perpetuated. And then you think of exporting goods. If it's a restaurant, they're going to be exporting food, and there's going to be food that, you know, is going to be from another country, like cashews, for example, or quinoa, and understanding maybe some of the exploitative labor practices that are used in growing that food or manufacturing that product. Yes, a Black person in Canada or America is getting some money for their goods, but is it worth another person in Bangladesh or in China being exploited horrifically for those goods? Is kind of my, you know, my balance with it. And so I think buying locally overall is probably a good idea. And if you can buy Black and local, it's a small step, but it's not solving the problem. It's not getting to the bottom line. It's not getting to the root of the problem.
For sure. I really find that point interesting about, you know, sometimes we don't know where the money is going, even if we are trying to put the money in the community, which is why it's important to make sure that we know where our money is going, and to make sure it's going like within the community, and it's, you know, supporting like Black people. You're also a committed animal rights activist. Is there any connections between the oppression of Black people and other people of color and the oppression of other animals?
That's a good question. This is something I've had to kind of confront recently a little bit, in terms of, I guess, the connection between the mistreatment of Black people and the mistreatment of kind of non-human animals. So you see a lot of, especially if you kind of look at, see movies perhaps, or read books where they do talk about, you know, the African slave trade, and how a lot of the times they would compare Black people to animals. They compare them to monkeys, they call them dogs, they call them animals. And that was a way of dehumanizing them and kind of making the mistreatment of them okay. And I think it's important for people to kind of think back on that a little. Like, why is comparing a person to another animal justification for mistreating them? Like, it's literally called chattel slavery, which is kind of making the comparison to cows and sheep and, you know, sheep and horses and other animals, and kind of how they're kind of used as livestock, kind of treated as objects and not really treated as persons. So I think there's kind of power in how that was weaponized against, you know, Black people historically. And I think as a Black person, it's my duty to kind of think of that relationship, and if this is what was used to demean, you know, my ancestors and make their treatment okay, why would it be okay for, you know, any animal to be treated that way at this point in time? And kind of extending that compassion and kind of linking it back to speciesism a little bit, because I think, okay, why was it okay to treat white people one way and Black people another way, in the same line of logic as why is it okay to treat dogs one way and cows another way? I think it's kind of like, it's the same exercise in logic and kind of following your preconceived notion or bias to its fullest extent, like going down that rabbit hole and seeing, where does it come from? What am I using to justify it, and how can I question this? And I do think it's the same process, because I do think it's the same capitalist mindset that kind of others people from humans to other animals. And I think it's that mindset of, I need to other this other person because there is a financial gain for it. And it's just easier to not regard them because then I don't have to think about it and I can keep living my life the way I have without questioning the privileges I have. And I think it's important to fight anti-Blackness and racism is the same as fighting speciesism in that sense of really asking those hard questions and following your bias.
That's a really good point to raise. And AFCO, actually, who is a Black vegan activist, often talks about how when colonizers, started colonizing and enslaving African people, they started othering those they wanted to, oppress. So white men was on top, and those whom they wanted to oppress, they were the others. They were considered, they were not considered persons or humans, which is, as you said, is a tool used to, deny rights to others. Is it tactical to talk about racism and speciesism at the same time? And what might be the downside of doing it or not doing it?
I think right now there is kind of a wave, there's kind of a spotlight being shone on anti-Black racism and specifically police brutality towards minority communities. And I think right now it is kind of important to make sure that we're all participating in shining that spotlight, not because one issue is more important than the other, but just because one issue has momentum right now. That doesn't mean stop doing vegan activism. That doesn't mean stop speaking out as an ally to non-human animals and really highlighting their issues. It does mean that if you are someone who maybe has solely focused on vegan issues and not focused on race, this is an opportunity to really get involved in that conversation and kind of expand your activism to be not just one issue activism, but understanding kind of the intersectionalities between some of these issues and how we can, we can walk and chew gum at the same time. But there are times you might need to focus on walking a bit more than chewing. I think that's
For sure.
my stance on that.
I completely agree. Like, it shouldn't come off as, derailing. We should be showing solidarity to the Black communities if we really want them to join our movement.
Yeah, now's not the time to say all lives matter. That's sure. Totally, it's true, but it's not the time. Right now, it's Black lives that are really in the spotlight of how at risk they can be in situations. And that's not a good slogan right now. You need to shelve that slogan for a little while because it's not helping anybody. It's not helping people want to join your movement. And I think it's important to understand, as a Black vegan, you want people to feel that solidarity and feel like you care and understand them, and alienating yourself from people who are potential allies and, could possibly hear a message is not going to help your message spread.
For sure. So in, North America and other communities, there's this myth that, veganism or animal rights are just like white people think. And it kind of really erases the work and the efforts of Black vegans who are, trying to really, work to get animal liberation on the table and to, dismantle animal oppression. What are some of, the myths that, you come across, and how do you address them as a Black vegan?
Yeah, there's a huge myth, I guess, that veganism is a white thing. And it's strange for several reasons. I think the history of I don't want to say plant-based diets, but largely plant and having vegetables and fruits in your diet, it isn't solely just a kind of woke millennial, kind of avocado toast thing, which it's kind of been branded lately. And I think that's largely been to dismiss it and really alienate people from getting involved. You know, I'm Jamaican, and, you know, we have the Rastas, and a lot of Rasta cuisine, like Rastas don't eat other animals. Like they, most of their food is local plants that they consume. And there's also, even, you know, in, you know, gurdwaras, kind of the Sikh temples.
Yeah, gurdwaras.
A lot of the time they serve a lot of plant-based meals because they want everyone to be able to eat their food. So they will serve, I think the largest in India, they serve probably, I think over 1,000 meals a day.
It's in Amritsar, Punjab.
Yeah.
And they serve the community twice a day. And it's like people from all backgrounds, all cultures, all castes, all races, all genders can come and have free meals. Yep.
Yeah, and I think there's also, what is it? I know in Israel, there's a really large Black community. I think they came from the United States, but this African descended kind of city. They like built their own city in Israel, and they've been making plant-based foods, vegan foods. Since their inception, I think in the 70s, 1969. I think it's Dimona is what it's called. And they're a really great example of a community that's built of veganism, and they're not white people. And there is a very big misconception. It's very unfortunate, but I think there are lots of Black vegans and other vegans of color kind of coming out and kind of making their claim that this isn't about being white, this isn't about it being a fad, and that I think it's actually quite offensive to say that compassion is tied to whiteness. That's very, like, why is that a white person thing? Like, why can't I be Black and care about other, you know, living beings? That's kind of offensive. So I think people are starting to realize it's not just white folks, it's not just young folks, it's people of all ages, races, genders, you know, economic backgrounds that are interested in doing the right thing and kind of, you know, helping non-human animals live a life free of oppression.
For sure. And I think some responsibility lies on the vegan community to uplift Black vegan voices and to share their work and, you know, amplify their voices and what they do. Because a lot of people don't even aware of the history of animal rights and how Black vegans have been involved for a really, really long time. In fact, this Black liberation, non-human liberation, earth liberation Black group in Philadelphia, it was called MOVE, which was bombed by their police department. They were actually raw vegans, and they fought against, you know, puppy mills and zoo and other forms of animal exploitation. And when I tell this to other vegans, they get shocked. Like, they're like, really? So a lot of people are not even aware of the history of the, you know, animal rights movement and how Black vegans have been actively involved in fighting against systemic, you know, their own oppression as well as the oppression of other marginalized groups, including non-human animals. So I think that's something we need to, you know, talk more about. Like the vegan community needs to talk more about. What are some of the things that vegans can do to support the Black community during this time?
There's a lot vegans can do. I think I want to start by saying, you know, vegans have been hurt. You know, they're hurt every day. There's been kind of a long time this kind of portraying society that's kind of, you know, in the media, wherever you go, just kind of a mocking kind of view towards veganism. And, you know, that can be deeply painful, kind of maybe being alienated from your friends and family who don't understand what you're doing and why, and really pushing back against, you know, your values. And you're living in a non-vegan world, a world where you're kind of confronted with kind of just the carnage that happens to, you know, non-human animals on a daily basis. Like, you know, and all the thing people use in our everyday lives, it's so commonplace. It's kind of, I wonder how people found so many ways to use these, these poor souls. But being hurt isn't an excuse for being reactionary and being defensive. And I think the first go-to is to be defensive when someone calls someone out on their racism or sexism or any other bias that has nothing, that isn't related to veganism. I think there's a natural reaction to be like, I'm a good person. I'm fighting for what's right. How dare you call me X, Y, or Z? And I think fighting that urge, that reaction to go on the defense, I think that's the first step. And being able to kind of learn from other people and being able to say, hey, I'm not perfect. Maybe there is something I can learn about race. Maybe there is something a Black person's telling me that might help me, just be a better human being and a better ally to Black people in general. And I think starting from that place of listening and not being reactionary is a huge step and the first step, because there are lots of Black vegans. There are lots of Black people who want to be vegan and learn about veganism. And they need to be able to feel safe in these communities, and they need to be able to express what they're going through and not immediately be dismissed and not immediately be called out because they're pointing out someone else's maybe bad behavior, or even just, not seeing something else that someone else is seeing. Or maybe carelessness in a certain situation.
For sure. Those are some really good points. And what can other groups who are fighting for justice can learn from the ongoing protests that are happening in the United States, Canada?
I think the fact that there is any kind of you look at happened with Regis, like her family's fundraising goals kind of for memorial services and other things relating to like investigation, they tripled their goal. Same with George Floyd. His family was able to get the funds to put him to rest, and we're seeing the police officer actually be arrested and going to trial for, like, I think there have been so many deaths. Like, there's 17 prominent, deaths in the US alone. I mean, Tamir Rice is 12 years old and the police end up getting off usually. And I think for the first time, it hasn't happened. And the fact that any of these things are happening, that the families are getting the money they need, the fact that the police and the people who are doing these killings, not only police, but are getting some kind of justice. I mean, I don't believe in punitive justice, but at least their crimes are being recognized and they are being not allowed to commit them any further. That's a huge step. And I think for activism, I think this is something to learn from. You don't get things by asking nicely. You don't get things by being polite and waiting your turn in line. You have to be loud and you have to become more of a problem than you are something that's able to be ignored. It has to be more annoying to put up with you than it is to ignore you. And I think that's what we've kind of learned from what's happening in the States. And to some extent, we just, it's always been that case. Like, slavery didn't end because slaves asked not to be enslaved. Like, there were slave revolts, there were riots, there was violence, but eventually the public opinion shifted. And same with women's rights. The suffrage movement, those women would set mailboxes on fire with explosives. Like, it was wild and ridiculously nasty, but it had to be done. And I think there's a lot of people who want to paint it with a completely black brush. Now, I do think when it comes to activism, it has to be specific. You have to have a specific list of requests to come out of that. It needs to be organized, but I think the message is that you do need to be loud and you do need to be able to be something that people can't ignore.
For sure, and there's lots of co-opting of Martin Luther King happening right now, like completely, missing his point and, cherry picking all the quote unquote peaceful stuff he said. But that's also another part of the problem. Like, people are just ignoring all the, protests and, revolutions and riots that happened in the past where certain demands were put forth, and people didn't just, request, they demanded, So before we wrap up, do you have any final comments?
Yes, thank you. Right now, I think there's a lot of support kind of needed with what's going on in the United States with Black Lives Matter there, and kind of the protests and riots that are going on. So there are people doing good work that kind of need some support. So there's the National Black Bail Fund, and that's for helping folks with bail just regularly outside of this. But right now, obviously, their volume is grown quite a bit in the last week. So any support they get would be helpful. There's Black Lives Matter. There is Black Lives Matter Toronto, and there's also Black Lives Matter groups in the US, specifically Minnesota. And there's the Minnesota Freedom Fund, which is also helping people with kind of legal issues and bail. So those are kind of the top 3 recommendations.
Thank you so much. I will share the link in the comments. That's it for today. And it was a pleasure to have you on the show. I personally learned a lot, and hopefully all our viewers and listeners also learned. And thank you so much, Debra, for coming to the show. And we will see you next week, same time. Bye-bye.